That can't be right. Your equipment must be glitching again. Otto shook his head. I'm telling you, I've double-checked it several times, he said. The error is large, of course, which is not surprising with numbers like that. However, the orders of magnitude are the same for all measurements. This thing is at least 800 million years old, maybe even more. Sven shifted his gaze from the physicist to the temple, even apart from the incredible information he had been given. The building, if only it could be called that, was astonishing, and that was putting it mildly. The slightly sloping walls jutted upward, lost in the bluish haze in the Agasphere sky, 7 kilometers high, 18 long, and 10 wide. Sven had seen pictures of it from orbit. The temple looked like a monstrously sized mashup of the Aztec pyramid and a neo-Gothic cathedral designed by a deranged artificial intelligence. But how could it have been preserved for so long? Sven patted his hand on the smooth, unbroken parapet of the outer ramp that led to the temple's main entrance. Both were on the same mind-boggling scale. The ramp was the width of 2 football fields, and the open rectangular opening of the entrance ended in a titanic crossbeam nearly half a kilometer high. Agasphere certainly has a very flat climate, but it couldn't have remained unchanged for nearly 1 billion years. That's simply impossible. Otto shrugged. I can't say anything about the climate. Matson and his department are dealing with that. By the way, the atmosphere is not the only mystery. Have you ever wondered how it is that Agasphere has breathable air, even though life has been gone for God knows how many millions of years, if it ever existed? Indeed. Sven scratched his chin thoughtfully. The inviolable rule of no life, no oxygen obviously didn't work on this strange planet. Sven was delighted by the atmosphere's near-perfect sterility as a man prone to allergies, but somehow he had overlooked the obvious. Well, the presence of the temple clearly tells us that there was once life on Agasphere, and what life! No single structure is even remotely comparable in scale to the temple in all known space. The physicist squinted and looked at Sven. Jamal is certainly not as skilled a prospector as Shandor was, but he is an excellent geologist. Still, he hadn't found any signs of life in the pits. Quartz, basalt, volcanic sediment, anything but organics. Sven spread his hands. Sorry, I'm not a paleontologist, but any artificial structures are more or less in the contact department. I hope there's no doubt that the temple is not a natural structure. Yes, it's hard to mistake it for a fossilized plant, Otto smiled. Although biologists would love it. They're going to get bed sores from idleness. Hopefully, they'll find something when the captain finally gives the go-ahead to explore the temple's interior. After the incident on the Adson's world, when because of an incredible coincidence of circumstances, the entire research party working on the surface almost got killed, the captain of the research ship, Lavoisier Sviatoslav Pokrovsky, became even more cautious than usual and categorically forbade anyone to even approach the temple closer than a few hundred meters. However, with the new information about the unimaginable age of the structure, hope loomed before Sven. If any dangers had once existed within the walls of this cyclopean structure, they would surely have been reduced to ashes in 1 billion years. Although, the temple itself had not turned to ashes, had it? There was only one way to find out. In the large dome, where a huge screen was broadcasting images from the remote control device Sven had borrowed from the biologists, almost all the personnel working on the planet's surface were gathered. Except for the temple and the oxygen atmosphere of mysterious origin, the second planet in the VGKC 483 system turned out to be boring and trivial, similar to Mars, sand, stones, and rocks from pole to pole. Agasphere was named so by the commander of the small scout, who discovered it 18 years ago. Interestingly, he somehow managed not to notice the temple, although the name seemed inspired by the analogy between the immortal biblical character and the age of the mysterious structure. The remote-controlled vehicle, a small tracked drone, had just arrived at a place that could conventionally be called the threshold of the temple. Because of the scale of the temple, there was no feeling for the observers that the drone was actually passing through a doorway. It was good that the unknown architect had decided to do without steps, and a sloping ramp several kilometers long led inside the temple. Considering that the entrance was 600 meters above the ground, Sven wouldn't have been surprised if each step was 60 meters high. The drone stopped for a few minutes, taking measurements. A bar of numbers ran to the right of the main camera image. Atmosphere, gravity, magnetic field. Everything was exactly the same as outside, anywhere on Agasphere. The operator moved the control joysticks, and the drone slowly crept forward. Contrary to the expectations of some of the excited members of the expedition, except for the size, the interior of the temple was nothing special. No ancient mechanisms, mysterious alien cult objects, works of art, or alien skeletons and mummies. Just an enormous hall, paved with stone slabs and lit by massive pillars of light falling from holes in the roof. "There's hardly any dust," said someone in the audience. "Strange, isn't it? It's as if someone had vacuumed everything just before we arrived." Indeed, there was almost no dust, only a thin layer in which the drone left a well-defined trace. Even given that the planet had an incredibly flat climate, why was there no trace of wear and weathering in the temple in a few 100 million years? The interior of the temple, though gigantic, still clearly did not match the exterior dimensions of the building. The drone operator zoomed in on the main camera and slowly rotated it 360 degrees. Everyone saw rectangular openings in the side walls, similar to the entrance one, but 3 times smaller. Obviously, it was entrances to some secondary rooms or corridors. The operator looked at Captain Pokrovsky standing next to him. He nodded, and the operator took the drone to the nearest side entrance. Since it was more than 3 kilometers from the middle of the main hall to the target, it took quite a while to get there. The amazement at the scale of the internal structure of the temple gradually receded into the background. The drone rolled on the flat floor, leaving a smooth path in a thin layer of dust, but generally, there was nothing to look at. Only the monotonous gray walls rise to unimaginable heights. In fact, the internal architecture of the temple was straightforward and utilitarian, providing little ground for fantasy, except for the most critical question: who built this fantastic structure, and why? The mission members gathered in the dome were increasingly distracted from the screen. The room was filled with the noise of soft conversations, and some of those who had their own work to do eventually went to their labs, asking to be notified if anything unusual was found. Despite being the expedition's chief expert on alien civilizations, Sven thought he understood no more than anyone else. Even the definition of temple he had given to the building was pure convention. It is quite a human tradition. If you find some big building, the purpose of which you do not understand, the easiest way out is to call it a temple. Religion will tolerate everything. Although the building could be anything, people had always called any large structure a temple, especially if it was ancient. Sven looked at the screen again. Straight angles, gigantic stone blocks. Is it stone? Why no traces of erosion? A thin layer of dust. Why so thin? Suddenly, Sven felt a rush of intense irritation. For once, he had been lucky enough to stumble upon a unique artifact. But what he can get out of it? Just a colossal stone box without the slightest hint of who built it, when, and why. It's a shame when the rarest amazing find turns out to be boring beyond comprehension. In a few days, Drones explored the temple up and down, and nothing unexpected was found in it. A giant central hall and several dozen smaller side halls. Along the two long walls were sloping ramps leading to the secondary halls of the second and third levels. The temple was built from a perfectly ordinary volcanic rock, similar to terrestrial basalt. There was no explanation yet as to why it remained untouched by erosion for hundreds of millions of years. However, it had become clear to everyone that the temple was essentially just a gigantic stone box. No ancient traps, artifacts, or anything like that. So Captain Pokrovsky finally gave the go-ahead for people to enter the building with maximum caution. Sven grinned. The term maximum caution sounded overly exciting. In fact, they simply drove several ATVs inside and split off in two batches in different directions. Otto and his two assistants wanted to take measurements at the temple's far wall. There was only one exit in the building, using the equipment they had loaded into two trailers. Sven and Noelani Akana from the biology department decided to drive through the side galleries all the way to the outermost hall of the upper level. "How did you convince the captain to let us use the ATVs?" Noelani asked. "Knowing his tendency to overreact, I was sure he'd send us on foot." They stopped at the beginning of the ramp. It was strange to realize that you'd been riding inside the vast building for a good 15 minutes, and you hadn't even gotten to the second floor yet. "Simple arithmetic," Sven smiled. "It's almost 20 kilometers from the entrance to this hall, from which you can go to the ramp and then the same distance to the second floor. If you travel by foot, it's a hike of several days, but you can do it in a few hours on ATVs. It's safer. I almost didn't even have to convince him." "Oh, I hadn't thought of that," Noelani said. "You're right. It's just that when you think about exploring a building, it doesn't occur that you'd be traveling dozens of kilometers." Sven looked up, where 1.5 kilometers above his head, the ceiling of the side gallery was lost in darkness. "Yes, I still can't get my head around how huge everything is here. Well, let's move on, shall we?" He started his ATV, and the sound of the engine echoing off the distant walls and ceiling came back to them from the darkness a few moments later with a rumbling roar. "Don't you think it's strange?" Noelani asked. "What, exactly?" Sven opened the large case he had taken out of the ATV's trunk and began to slowly and methodically mount the laser scanner on a tripod. The drone had its own scanner, but it was rather weak, and Sven wanted to get a model of the interior of the corner hall as detailed as possible. There were some anomalies in the remote's image, either artifacts or irregularities on the walls, and Sven wanted to see if there was anything useful concerning his specialty. Maybe he'd be lucky enough to find some inscriptions or images carved into the mysterious building material. All of it. Noelani was as methodically collecting dust samples from the floor, checking the coordinates on the tablet, where a hall plan was drawn and divided into neat squares. Someone, God knows how long ago, had built this gigantic thing and then disappeared without leaving the slightest hint of himself. Not a line, not a letter, not a picture. Noelani put another cotton swab into a sealed tube, inserted it into a special box, then got on the ATV, drove 50 meters away, and repeated the procedure. She had already traveled at least 1 kilometer, so they were talking on the radio, but Sven could see the light from her headlights. 800 million years, he said. That's a long time. This temple, or whatever it is, was already standing when no organisms on Earth were more complex than sponges. How do we know there wasn't some time ago when the whole surface was painted and stenciled? I don't think so. The temple was so quiet that Sven could hear the tinkling of glass and the muffled rustle of Noelani's footsteps. There are no signs of erosion on the walls, so there is no reason for the image's disappearance. Complete disappearance, mind you. No remnants of paint, no evidence of carvings that once existed. It feels like the temple was built not 800 million, but 8 years ago. Yeah, I agree with you there. The earpiece clicked 3 times. Hold on, Noe. Otto's on the line. Sven changed the channel. What is it, Otto? He asked cheerfully. Have you found the solution to the great temple beyond time yet? The solution to the temple? Otto's voice had changed almost unrecognizably, becoming something creaky and shrill. Sven thought it was the excitement. The physicists must have found something interesting. The temple is nothing, Sven. We've found the solution to everything, our whole damn universe. I was only in the cell for 3 minutes and managed to… Otto suddenly stopped talking. Sven heard a noise as if something had fallen, then hoarse, heavy breathing, then Otto's voice again, but it was different, shaken, full of terror, trembling. God, Sven, Huang, he's… Damn it, breathe. Breathe, my friend, please. Sven heard a rhythmic noise as if someone was running, working his arms in a measured motion, or performing the CPR. Shit. Otto was breathing hard. He was breathing very hard, with whistling and wheezing. Sven, I can't get communication with Lavoisier in the camp. Some kind of interference. He's bad, but he's still breathing. God, I'm affected too. And I've only been here a minute. Otto sobbed. But I've got to get Alan out. He's still in there. I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I must. Otto paused, catching his breath. Contact the camp and race here, in case we don't… Never mind. Whatever happens, don't go into the chamber. Under no circumstances. We'll be beyond help. And you. Beware of the wave. The comm went silent. Sven stared dazedly at Noelani's headlights moving in the distance until he realized she was calling him relentlessly and changed the channel. Something's up with the physicists, he said, ahead of any questions. Quit what you're doing and come back. We have to figure out what to do. Suddenly the warm light of the headlights that cut through the darkness of the temple seemed to him very weak, small, and helpless. Like themselves, microscopic bugs on a giant stone tank floor, unexpectedly turning from mysterious to incomprehensibly dangerous. They were unable to reach the camp on comms. There was only faint white noise on all channels, not even a hint of a signal getting through, even though Noelani and Sven could communicate with each other without problem. The physicists were no longer in contact. And given Otto's last words, Sven had the darkest premonitions about the reasons for their silence. Emotionally, Sven was eager to go to the place where something terrible had happened to his colleagues, but he understood that it was necessary to inform the others. First of all, Captain Pokrovsky, because people in the base camp and on the ship still had no idea that something unforeseen had happened in the temple. However, it took a lot of work to persuade Noelani. You go to the camp if you need to, she said. I want to help Otto. Sven had a strong suspicion that neither Otto nor the other 2 physicists needed help anymore, but he didn't want to use such a terrible argument with the girl. He had to come at it from the other side. Whatever happened, it's almost certainly connected with the temple, he said. That means with the alien structure. If anyone in this mission knows how to work with aliens or their artifacts, it's me, and we should definitely notify Pokrovsky to organize a rescue. All right, she said at last. You got it. You just keep in touch while comms are working, and be careful, okay? And before Sven could answer, she was speeding her ATV for the exit of the temple. Okay, he answered into the communicator, suddenly feeling incredibly lonely in the monstrous interior of the temple, filled with still darkness that now seemed imbued with unknown danger. He had seen the place where the physicists were working from a distance. Otto approached the matter with his usual thoroughness. The physicists had set up good lighting from several spotlights connected to a generator, a fieldwork table, and equipment racks nearby. Sven saw all of this from a distance, and when he got closer, he noticed another detail he would rather not have seen: a man lying next to the table in a bright spot of light. Sven swallowed and cranked the throttle to full blast. Noelani had lost contact with him a few minutes ago when the girl had driven outside the temple. Well, perhaps it was for the best. He wouldn't have to tell her that Thi Hoang, a junior member of the physics department and a great comedian, a favorite of the entire expedition, was dead. Hoang looked so different that Sven could hardly recognize him. A thin, bony body with sagging, flabby skin mottled with age spots, a face with sharpened features and sunken eyes, sparse strands of gray on his skull. Most eerie was the broad, dreamy smile on the dead face. Before he died, Hoang had turned into an ancient old man, and yet while dying, he was perfectly happy. A few meters behind the table, the massive back wall of the temple was receding into darkness. The spotlights were positioned to illuminate the same spot in the wall in which a small rectangular gap was visible. Sven walked over and peered into the hole. The passage went 10 meters deep into the wall, and then he could see a room. It was relatively small, microscopic by the standards of the temple, because it was pretty human in scale. In the light of the lighting tape hanging in the passage and another spotlight in the room, Sven could clearly see the far wall. He also saw Otto and Alan Masterson lying on the room floor, or rather, what was left of them. If Hoang looked like a decrepit old man, there were two ancient, dried-up mummies lying on stone slabs in the thickness of the temple wall. Sven's first impulse was to go inside immediately, but he held back, remembering Otto's words. "Under no circumstances enter the chamber." It sounded kind of delusional if it weren't for the two mummies on the floor and the 30-year-old Hoang, who had died of old age. Damn it. If only Otto had time to elaborate. Now, on the scene, thinking over the physicist's half-coherent story, Sven could reconstruct what had happened with a certain degree of probability, though he had no idea what caused all that. Otto and his assistants had found this passage in the wall and the inner chamber, and decided to investigate them without reporting anything beforehand. Unfortunately, it was in the physicist's nature to keep everybody unaware of his studies. They set up lights and equipment and went inside. Not awaiting any surprises or traps, you do not expect to find anything in good functioning condition in an almost billion-year-old structure. In the chamber, they had some kind of insight, after which Otto came out and contacted Sven, and while they were talking, a monstrously aged Hoang came out, fell, and died. Otto tried to resuscitate him and then went back into the chamber to get Alan out, and stayed in there himself. Sven understood that he couldn't go inside. Otto and Alan are beyond help, and it's too early for him to become a third mummy. But what had happened here? Sven couldn't imagine what could turn a young, healthy man into an old ruin, or even a mummy in a matter of moments. Some kind of radiation? But none of the types of radiation known to science had such an effect, although many could kill. At the same time, the lights in the passage and the chamber were still on, so the equipment was okay. Sven went to the desk to look for any notes, hypotheses, guesses, or anything to hold on to, and at that moment, he was struck. A strange, alien city spread out under an unaccustomed starry sky. At first, it seemed as if there was something wrong with his eyesight, but Sven quickly realized that it was an optical effect. The endless blocks of buildings stretched away, lost in the haze, to the very horizon, and the edges of the horizon seemed to curve upward, as if the city were located in a vast bowl. Sven couldn't feel his body, bow, or even put his hands to his face, but he was looking down as if he were standing on the roof of a building. There was something familiar about the buildings around him, despite how strange-looking they were. But Sven couldn't make out what it was until his point of view suddenly changed, as if he had taken off into the air and the city's streets began to recede. It finally dawned on him that he was seeing some kind of footage. The camera moved horizontally over the city. Sven noticed the city streets were empty. No inhabitants, no cars, just solid rows and blocks of buildings, uniform in their inhuman architecture, yet somehow different. Then the camera lowered again, taking a close-up of one of the buildings, and Sven suddenly realized why everything seemed familiar to him. The whole city was made up of buildings like the temple. His imagination, which had not been very good at dealing with the scale of the temple before, refused to accept such a leap. There were thousands, hundreds of thousands of temples here. The camera soared into the sky, covering more and more area, accelerating until the stunned Sven saw that the bent edges of the horizon were not an illusion, that the city was not on a planet, but on a giant concave platform. Before he could realize what he was seeing, the image jumped, moving away from the platform at an incredible speed. Now he was looking at the arm of the galaxy with the red dot marking, obviously the platform coordinates. Then Sven saw something else, on the very edge of comprehension, but his consciousness was already fading. He was jolted awake by something painfully digging into his chest. He struggled to open his eyes and saw that he was lying slumped across the seat of the ATV, right on the field bag he had left behind. Apparently, he had crawled half-consciously to the vehicle before finally passing out, or waking up. Sven couldn't remember if there had been any gap between the last incoherent visions and the sharp pain in his chest, but he was grateful for the instinct that had pulled him away from the damned passage to the mysterious room. Really, it was time to get away. Surprised at how weak and disobedient his arms, legs, and whole body had become, he climbed onto the ATV, started the engine, and drove the vehicle toward the temple exit. His eyesight was a mess. Sven could only see the ATV's dashboard as if through a cloudy glass. But in the completely empty temple, he didn't have to worry about running into anything, and the giant doorway was an excellent landmark. He met the rescue party at the entrance, a 6-wheeled cargo rover with 8 people in it, including Noelani. She and 3 others immediately jumped onto the stone slabs and ran up to Sven. "I told you, I'd be fine," Sven said, watching the horrified faces of those around him. "I just need to get some rest." He wiped his face with his senile, weak hand and fell off the ATV. After 2 weeks spent in the temple and out at the vast expanse of Agasphere, the relatively spacious by shipboard standards infirmary ward was causing a slight background claustrophobia. On the other hand, Sven felt fed up with open space and large-scale structures. After everything on Agasphere, even a room the size of a closet would seem cozy and safe. The doctor said Sven had been unconscious for 3 days, and he'd been kept on life support devices and intravenous nutrition for almost all of that time. 100 years ago, you would probably barely had enough time to write the testament, Dr. Acevedo said, sitting in the chair beside Sven's bed. Now geriatrics has come a long way. God, I can't believe I'm telling you this. Acevedo shook his head sadly. We've done all we can, and I hope the Metu Clinic, they are leading the way in geriatric research, will do their best. I think they'll be able to level out the process to some extent and take a few years off. You have an extremely interesting case. I'm sorry, Acevedo interrupted himself. That was rude of me. Sven smiled. It's all right, Doc. You haven't offended me. The case is really unique. It is unlikely that they will find a man who has aged half a century in a few minutes. Why don't you tell me how things are now? Are the people evacuated from Agasphere? Acevedo stood up. Captain Pokrovsky asked me to notify him as soon as I could talk to you. I believe he's better qualified than I am to inform you of everything. He'll be here in a few minutes. In the meantime, with your permission, the doctor moved the regulator on the drip. This will give you some strength. Sven closed his eyes. Even a short conversation like this made him a little tired. He could only hope that the glucose mixed with stimulants, or whatever the doctor was pumping into his veins, would give him the strength to endure a much longer and more meaningful conversation with Pokrovsky. Growing old is not a pleasant process, but it is doubly unpleasant if it happens instantly and not in the course of decades, during which a person has time to get used to and come to terms with his new state. Ugh, or would it be the old state? Sven grinned involuntarily at the unexpected wordplay, and at that moment, the captain entered the room, followed by Noelani. "Sven, I'm so sorry." Noelani was ahead of the captain, leaning over to Sven and hugging him tightly. Sven squeaked pitifully. "Careful, Noe, please. I'm not much for violent displays of emotion now. Imagine you're hugging your great-great-grandfather." The girl blushed and pulled back. Sven noted that she looked different somehow. More mature? Yes. The experience would leave a mark on many people. Pokrovsky sat in the chair where Dr. Acevedo had just sat, crossed his legs, and interlocked his fingers on the knee. Noelani took a seat on the bed at Sven's feet. "Well, it looks like you've acted as savior again," Pokrovsky said, smiling. "If you hadn't managed to get out of the temple, we would definitely have tried to get you out of there." He grimaced. "You and poor Otto, Alan, and Huang." "I'm afraid they're destined to stay there forever," Sven said. "I'm just lucky. If I had fainted on the way and fallen off the vehicle—" "But you didn't," Pokrovsky said firmly. "Moreover, you managed to convince those who met you not to enter the temple." Sven looked at him, puzzled. "I did? I don't remember that, sir. I thought I passed out right away." "Almost," Pokrovsky said. "I must say that your appearance was eloquent enough, but while already losing consciousness, you managed to say something like, 'in the temple of death.'" "The vault of death," Noelani said. Sven took another look at her face. No, there was definitely something wrong with her, and her voice had changed. It was as if it were sharper, rougher. It suddenly struck him. "Oh my God, Noé, you—" Pokrovsky nodded. "Before we could completely evacuate the camp, the outburst from the temple reached those who remained there," he said. "Apparently, the power of the impact does not decrease linearly, but more quickly. Otherwise, the consequences could have been more tragic, but all those who remained on the surface of Agasphere lost a few years. So small compared to you," Noelani said, smiling wryly. "That makes sense," Sven said thoughtfully. Part of his mind was occupied with guilt and bitterness. Noelani, a few years of youth, and the other part was already hypothesizing and theorizing. The information wave hit me some distance from the main chamber, though not far away. Apparently, the decreasing function is quite sharp, and I didn't get hit as hard as Otto and the others. Pokrovsky looked at Sven inquisitively. "An information wave?" Sven shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know how to define it correctly. You need a physicist here, not an exo-psychologist." He paused. "Yeah. Noe, tell me, did you feel anything when the wave reached the camp?" Noelani shook her head. "Nothing in particular. There was some sense of touching distant depths, of something great, but all very vague, and behind the general commotion, no one paid much attention to it. We didn't even notice our changes right away." "That's right," Sven nodded. "It was almost a fading echo." He looked at Pokrovsky. "Sir, the thing is that the temple is not a temple at all. It's actually a memory cell, and what killed the physicists, crippled me, and stole several years of life from the rest of us is not some horrible death wave, but an information packet." Don't ask me what form that information was transmitted in, he said, seeing the captain's and Noelani's blank stares. But it was information. It wasn't even what was written in the cell, but only, so to speak, the familiarization part. Something like the boot information that is displayed on the screen when a computer boots up. He was quiet for a moment. Before returning for Alan, Otto told me they had found the clue to our entire universe. I think the cell managed to transmit to them some of what was recorded in it. The hypothesis that information can directly affect living organisms has been around for a long time, Noelani said. Although, of course, almost all scientists considered it marginal. I think the temple, I'll call it that for now so as not to confuse myself, somehow uses time itself to record information, Sven said. This also explains the incredible preservation of the building throughout almost 1 billion years. And I can see why there are no inscriptions or anything like that. We don't write anything on every microcrystal inside the processors either. This wave has no effect on tech devices except for impenetrability for all types of communication, Pokrovsky said. But the animals we used for some testing, unfortunately, died. We left a few automated cages with them in the camp. We thought we would take them back later with a remote landing module. The longer the exposure to the information release, the stronger the effect, Sven said. The temple gave out information in pulses with increasing duration and power. The 3 physicists were together in the startup chamber when they received the first packet. Immediately afterward, Otto came out from the chamber to contact me, at which point Huang and Alan received another pulse. Huang left the chamber and died, and Otto returned for Alan and got hit by another pulse. He stopped talking to catch his breath. Dr. Acevedo's stimulants were working, but they could only mobilize the body's existing strength, and Sven was now running low on that resource. I think the cell was triggered by the presence of intelligent beings. Or just living beings, Noelani said. There's a reason why Agasphere is practically sterile. It's like a microelectronics factory or a computer center. No one wants a cockroach stuck somewhere between the contacts. The question could be put a little differently, Pokrovsky said dryly. Was Agasphere sterilized for the smooth functioning of the temple? Or because of him? Sven suddenly felt an irresistible urge to close his eyes and take a nap. He pulled his already floating consciousness to the surface, especially since what he was about to say could cause insomnia in anyone, even someone as inflexible as Captain Pokrovsky. I hate to break it to you, sir, but the real question is something else, he said. What happens if the entire computing device, whose memory cell is the temple, turns on and starts working? What measures are provided by its creators to maintain purity inside the circuit? There was a tense silence. Finally, Pokrovsky asked, "What do you mean?" "In the part of the package that I managed to get..." Sven kept his eyes closed. He felt so weak. It contained all the same things as the normal boot information. For example, information about the system, its dimensions. And what were its dimensions? Do you remember? Sven paused for a moment, gathering his strength. "I'm afraid to disappoint you, sir, but as large as possible." He remembered the picture dotted with red sparks. That computer system is the entire universe. I keep thinking, what if we just turned it on?